Good morning. First, I should say that as the elected or the appointed moderator of this panel, we all recognize one of the more important functions that we serve here, which is that we are between you and lunch. And so we hope both to be useful in moving the discussion forward and also to be engaging enough to distract you long enough that when lunch comes that you'll be pleasantly surprised. So some of you may be asking yourselves, what exactly does it mean to police a community in motion, and what is a community in motion? I don't know that we have to go back very far to understand what that means if we think about what happened recently in Charleston. The Reverend Goff gave the sermon this past Sunday, and I'm reminded of my personal deep connection to Mother Emanuel Church and to the connection between the tragedy, the terrorism, and the hope in that community and the work that everybody in here is doing. So what we mean by communities in motion are communities that are moving through this formative democratic experience called America, where race has been the oft-forgotten original sin, and where we are trying to figure out the ways that we can avoid policing one community against another community, one community for the safety of another community, and begin policing citizens against our own disorder and our own faults and flaws. So it's not an accident that today we have law enforcement representing one of the iconic locations of civil rights struggle and success, and that we have men of faith. I have no idea what an academic is doing on this panel, but I suppose we'll find out. So that's what we're talking about. We are not just in the midst of a moment. You know, we've been making reference to this. This is the beginning of not just a page, but a chapter in our children's history books. And we're writing it. So that's what it means to be in motion, to be in the midst of history before it's written down and made concrete into statues. So we're going to move from history and move to the present through faith, and then I'll try and intellectualize as the academic at the end. We'll do about 10 minutes apiece, and then have a bit of conversation, hopefully open up to the rest of y'all, but if we have time before we get to lunch. Okay, and because not all of us are in the black church, but we are all of the black church, we may ask for a little bit of call and response during the course of this. You don't have to say amen, though some of you may feel so moved. But we're hoping for a bit of interaction. So does that sound good as a plan for y'all? Okay, thank you. And thank you for the amen. All right, so Chief Roper, to you.
All right. Let me start by saying greetings to everyone. It's an honor to be here. And let me also ask the Birmingham team to please stand. Yep. It takes teamwork, and we have a wonderful team representing the great city of Birmingham. So I'm honored to be with you today, and let me start with a quote. Birmingham is the most thoroughly segregated city in America. That's what Dr. King said in 1963, talking about our city, because their segregation was ruthlessly enforced by the Birmingham Police Department. We were the arms and legs of the most racist government in the nation. Just let that sink in a little bit. We were the arms and legs of the most racist government in America. So when you see the grainy footage, the black and white footage of hundreds and hundreds of people being brutalized in the streets of downtown Birmingham, we arrested children by the thousands. We filled the jail up with so many kids that we had to take them out to Fair Park, where the Birmingham Police Department locked kids up in the animal holding cells at the Fair Park. So a brutal, brutal history. So even today, we police under the shadow of the movement. I recognize that so fully, being a native son of Birmingham, remembering the stories that my grandmom told us as she raised 5 of us about her role in the struggle. And so it's important for us as a police department to recognize our history, because history has a way of coloring the present. And so we have to continually remind our officers of that, because we're hiring younger officers now who don't understand and don't recognize the history of the city. And so we're working through the years to develop that understanding and awareness so that they can see it through the citizens' eyes whenever there's an allegation of excessive force, and how some people, their minds go back to 1963, 1964, and what our police department stood for. I've been chief now for 7.5 years. A dream job, because when I started the police academy 30 plus years ago, I was living in one of our public housing communities right there in the city. And who would have thought that a young kid in the public housing community could one day be the chief of the city that he was born in? So I think that speaks to the promise of America, that we are a land of opportunity. But we have our challenges. And so as chief, we tried to establish a three-legged stool, and the first leg is engage the community, because we understood that for us to be successful and work our way through the past memories of our police department, we have to build community relationships in a way that we've never done before. So we were honored, and we're still honored, to be one of the 6 sites chosen by DOJ on this national initiative for building community trust and justice, as we look at implicit bias and procedural justice and racial reconciliation, because we can do so much better in those areas. Our second part of that three-legged stool is enhance the infrastructure, because we knew we need to build a better police department from the inside out. And from that, we have to concentrate on what we call our 5 pillars of success. Number 1 is people, how we hire people, how we select people. And our people have to represent the communities that we serve. So we have to have the diversity so that every member of our communities can look at our police department and see themselves. But second, once we hire good people, we have to have good training, realistic training. We have to build better officers. We have to do more with de-escalation skills and trying to de-conflict issues and be more sensitive and try to do other alternative approaches rather than arrest our way out of situations, because we really can't do that. It hasn't worked through the years. But then we have to have good policies. We're a national accredited organization. We're up for our 9th accreditation this year through CALEA. And we still have work to do there. But then the 4th pillar is supervision. Supervisors have to buy into what we're doing. And a role of leadership is making sure supervision is on board, because when supervision is not on board, the doers, the officers, the professional staff members out there doing the work can't fully buy in if their supervisors aren't buying in. So the way we select supervisors is so important. So we just scrapped our whole promotion process, just scrapped it and started over. And so we'll have our new promotions in a couple of months under this new system, because we have to promote based on the qualities and values that we're looking for. And I think that's so important. Then the 5th pillar is discipline, which simply means doing the right things and enforcing accountability. We have amazing people like you do that are out there doing heavy lifting every day. But then there's a small group that's not doing the right thing, and we can't look the other way. We've got to enforce the discipline and the accountability so that we can be a better agency in the future. And so when we put all of that together with our partnership with John Jay and the National Network, we have some momentum. We're now into the Cities United. We are a big supporter of My Brother's Keeper. We're actually hosting the Cities United Conference next year. It was in Philadelphia this year, so it'll be in Birmingham next year. So the mayor's office is really trying to lead this comprehensive approach to providing better services to our citizens. But the police department is the most visible arm of city government, and we're facing challenges. And we have to have 3 approaches to solve them, at least I think. Number 1, we've got to value our communities and the relationships. Community relations has to be purposeful. It can't just be a quote on the wall. And every officer out there is a community relations specialist, whether they realize it or not, and whether we want them to be or not. How they interact with our community goes a long way with really showing the standard of what we take as important regarding community relations. Then second, we have to lead our way through it. We've got to lead out front. We've got to model what we're looking for. And then third, we've got to embrace change. Police work is changing, and we either have to get on board or we're going to be left behind. As David Kennedy says, we're at a moment now that if we lose it, we may not ever get it back again. And I know in Birmingham, we want to seize the moment as we relentlessly pursue excellence. Thank you.
Dr. King says that love is the only cement that can hold this broken community together. And when I am commanded to love, I am commanded to restore community, to resist injustice, and to meet the needs of my brother. And I like the way Dr. West goes on and says that justice is then what love looks like in the public. In August 9th, when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, it absolutely did start a new conversation and a new recognition of a conversation that many of us were aware of for a very long time. And now that the media is choosing to cover messages and to try to present a framing, it's only kind of bringing to bear, I think, what we've been carrying for a long time, which is the storied history of a disconnect between law enforcement and communities that have been impacted by a negative relationship with the police, that have been impacted by police brutality, neighborhoods that have been impacted living as under-resourced communities, high crime, and high levels of challenge. So I think oftentimes when we think about what then is the next steps forward in order to move towards healing, I actually think before we take that step forward, we actually have to take a step back to think about realizing that in our story, in order to say that we're going to get to healing means that we actually need to know what a healthy expression looks like. But our history has actually not afforded us that yet, which means that we're going to have to work towards somewhat of a mystery and somewhat of an idea that none of us have yet to actually live in. We have not actually lived into yet in the history of America a relationship where communities, particularly black and brown communities, have had a tremendously successful relationship with police departments that have not been scarred by excessive force and brutality and all different kinds of injustice. And so I think it's going to take us having a lot of courage to be able to actually work towards something that we may not have seen yet. I think in Oakland, one of the ways that we tried to begin to think about this was through an expression, a part of our ceasefire strategy called the procedural justice training, where we began to kind of create this atmosphere for our officers to have this workshop, this training, to be able to raise their capacity to, again, think about this whole conversation of how are they able to provide the kind of law enforcement that we all want and need, but equally, how do we do that in such a way that really lifts up the best about what policing really is? I think one of the things that was helpful in our space was including community presenters in that training, recognizing that the only way that people, and particularly I believe our officers, are going to be able to have a deep dive, concentrated understanding of the historical impact in communities of color is to hear from those communities. That we must actually hear from folks. Now, I do believe that, you know, in some of the spaces that we have some folks that have manufactured rage, right? In the sense that some of the folks aren't necessarily people who have been impacted by the negative relationship between police and community, but that must not overshadow the deep, abiding despair that has gone on in many of our communities in relationship with police. And so I think one of the big questions and opportunities that popped up for us out of our procedural justice training in Oakland was how could we begin to inject our community members to tell their stories, to actually create more conversation between police and community so that we could begin to work towards a city and a story that we all want to belong to. When I was in Ferguson, Missouri several times as a part of the PICO National Network, along with my brother, Mike McBride, who's the chair of the Live Free campaign. And as we were there, I was arrested for the first time in my life while we were there in Ferguson, but it provided some great conversations that we had while I was in custody, one with my arresting officer where I began to tell him about the story, my own personal story, that the only time I've had a gun pointed at me was by a police officer when I was 18 years old, putting myself through college in San Francisco. And in that moment, we began to have this conversation around his value that he wanted to ensure that he was going to go home safe that night, and all officers want to ensure that they want to go home safe that night. And I lifted up a shared value that I wanted to go home safe that night as well. And the reality is that he's a trained law enforcement official. I'm not an officially trained citizen. You know, I'm just a citizen. Somebody say amen.
Amen.
So and with that respect, we want to figure out how do we create a way forward. And as we, contended back and forth and had this discussion, when we got towards the end, one of the powerful things he said is, well, with what I need and with what you need, I don't have an answer. The reality is we got to come up with something different. And I said, officer, that is the whole reason why we are here in Ferguson. It's not because we believe police are bad. I volunteered hundreds of hours with the Oakland Police Department, and as I told them, if I believed officers were bad, I would not volunteer my time to spend time. We don't believe that all officers are bad. We believe we have some rogue police officers. I told them, I believe in any organization, you've got rogue individuals. I know we got some rogue preachers, because I know some of them, amen, all right? Amen. So every institution has some rogue individuals, but we're not going to be able to get to a place of healing if we're not willing to have hard conversations to figure out how do we actually inject our community members in places that lift up and leverage our faith institutions. As I get ready to close, the one thing you'll find pretty much in every major inner city corridor on every corner is a liquor store and a church. Right? But we've got to think about how do we begin to leverage these faith institutions, not as somewhat kind of just window dressing when it's time for us to do press conferences, but how do we actually lean into the moral leaders that are living in our community to actually be able to invest in their capacity and ensure that they're providing leadership in the work of peacemaking that needs to happen in our cities, both between communities and law enforcement and also with the expressions of violence that happen in the inner city. I think standing here and thinking on the backdrop of Charleston, which impacted many of us very greatly, I think, it's very important for us to see the kind of powerful moral leadership that came to us by looking at how faith leaders responded to that act of terrorism in Charleston. How do we begin to think about getting more community and faith leaders organized together to be able to express very powerful leadership for us in our strategies so that we're actually able to see results happen? I think, and I promise it's going to be my last statement, the preacher, we got 13 final statements. But I will say this in closing, that the road towards that leads to relationship is a long road. And I think oftentimes we're looking for transactional ways to get there instead of transformative processes to explore. And I think we've got to recognize that in communities, most of them are starting off, particularly black and brown communities that have been under-resourced and underrepresented. They are starting in a place of distrust. That is factually based. Oakland had a history of police brutality. That was factually based. So they're starting in a place of distrust. I believe we have to move from the place of distrust to skepticism, from skepticism to tolerance, from tolerance to trust, and ultimately from trust to partnership. But we're not going to be able to get there overnight. One, training's not going to get us there overnight. But if we have a very courageous agreement to keep working towards this process, and for community and faith leaders, my encouragement is this: we've got to come outside of our four walls of our churches. We need to engage in relationship with our young leaders that are leading a protest movement and begin to think about how do we reduce violence, regardless as to whether it's community violence or police violence in our cities and community, that create a story that we all want to belong to. Amen.
So first of all, I want to thank whoever's responsible for allowing me to be on this panel, and I want to echo a few things that I've heard and then try to move the conversation one step forward. First of all, I think we can all agree, based on what we've heard today, that the real problem is not that we're as much divided as we are disconnected. And one of the ways that we can connect ourselves, particularly as it relates to this work, is by tapping into not just the principles that have been espoused by the national network, but some of the tools that are already latent, some of the tools that are already inherent in any community, like the faith community, because as has already been articulated, logistically, culturally, politically, and pragmatically, there are advantages to making sure that the partnership between law enforcement and the community of faith is tight. Logistically, there's a church on every corner, and in every distressed community, there are churches there are people of faith who are active but perhaps unnoticed because all heroes don't make the headlines. Culturally, particularly in the African American community, the church functions not just as a faith-based situation, but as the cultural center. Politically, we all know that the real powerhouse in the communities of color are the communities of faith. Hence, the regular trek from politicians to the black church when it's time to get elected. Pragmatically, there are things that the community of faith offers that fit perfectly into what is being promoted through the moral voice in all of these initiatives, things like truth, things like forgiveness, things like hope. So the issue becomes, as it relates to the moral voice component of any of the strategies that we've talked about, how can we amplify them or if need be modify them, but more importantly, getting to my brother's point, how ultimately can we codify them in such a way that just like law enforcement is continually working together on a daily basis thinking about these things, that somehow or another we need to have a structure put in place so that the people of faith, people of the community, the young leaders, the voices, like Glenn Martin says, the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, how those voices can be brought to the fore on a consistent basis, not when it's crisis, but on a daily basis so that we're working on this on a systematic and a comprehensive way. So Rockford, Illinois, and I'm glad to have the Chief of Police here from Rockford, Illinois, Chief Chet Epperson. We've been, over the years, been trying to work on this piece, recognizing that just like when we talk about crime, how there are a small percentage of people who are really driving the violent crime, if you think about it, when we come to peace, there's a small percentage of influencers within each community who are really driving peace. That is, those who have influence to really get things done on a positive aspect. And I think that we are trying to make some efforts to move forward in that regard by recognizing that there's a place for advocacy, larger groups that advocate for political change. There's a place for collaboration where we get together just to do some project-based work, but there ought to be a place for collective impact where, because we have a common agenda, shared measurement systems, and continuous communication, we're actually working on this on a regular basis, and we're allowing the influencers, we can't wait for everybody to get on board, but there's a tipping point that comes when you get the right amount of influencers together to really move the work forward. Last thing I'll say is that in all of this, and this is something else I've heard today and I want to sort of highlight, we can't discount the impact of small relationships. What I mean by that, we're here today from the testimony I've heard between David, President Jeremy, the police commissioner, because of some relationships. It wasn't political, it was a personal relationship. And even in Birmingham, if I read my history correct, when Eleanor Roosevelt went past the color line, there was a concert or some kind of event, and the city code divided people of color from white people, but she broached that line because of her relationship with Marian Anderson. So I would like to just highlight the fact that this network has some important work, and it's not all policy level. There's some relationships that can be developed here and that have developed that really have an exponentially greater return on investment than you would think they would have.
So we're touching our phones just to see the time, and I'm now realizing the consequences of a 5-minute break here, which is that it's about a half hour. So rather than try and transition into call and response, let me go ahead and see if I can't wrap up with this. And ironically, I'll be the academic, the most godless group of folks that there can be, and I will start with Scripture. For those of you who've seen me talk or who I've spoken to the past year, you'll know I've been studying in my life on Proverbs for the past year. And the passage I keep coming back to is Proverbs 29:18. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Now that's true, but it's also a mistranslation from the original Hebrew, which is why I've been studying it. The original Hebrew word that is translated as perish is para. which I know all of you are biblical Hebrew scholars, so you know, that para means to be shaken loose. Somebody say shaken loose. And I'm reminded of this because of a conversation, a series of conversations, but really one moment in a conversation with a bunch of youth leaders from Hands Up United, from Black Lives Matter, from the Dream Defenders, from a number of different places. These are all folks under the age of 25 who are really doing inspirational work, just tremendous work. And they were upset, and they made me upset by what they were upset about. In this meeting, though they were upset about interactions with law enforcement, they were upset about their communities, they were most upset in this meeting about the fact that it was so much harder to gauge what success looked like. And they were getting nostalgic for the days when signs were on the water fountains. And I was confused and my feelings were hurt. I said, how are you upset that segregation is no longer legal? They said, well, when the signs were on the water fountains, we knew what the enemy was. The enemy was people. And I said, but the Bible says the enemy is never people, it's principles, it's principalities, right? It's institutions. I said, yeah, but when we had these kinds of goals, there was more, and I have to say it, there was more glory in the movement. We knew what the enemy was, and there was a direction for it. Right now, we're shutting down Apple stores and trying to lobby DOJ. And that's a hard thing to do. So I would argue that in the transition from a civil rights movement that we understood to the moment where we are now, we have been shaken loose. And I don't just mean that in a scriptural way. What I mean is that the tools for progress have needed to change, but they haven't changed at a pace with the progress that we've actually made. So let me take that down into my little nerd land. Center for Policing Equity, over the last several years, as many of you know, has been putting together the National Justice Database. That's an attempt to solve the national embarrassment of the fact that we don't know anything on a national level with regards to police behavior. So now we've got about a third of the U.S. by population in terms of the police departments that have signed on to hand over their data, administrative data, which will include things like pedestrian stops, vehicle stops, use of force. Right? Officers that are involved in departments that are participating in the National Justice Database agree to take climate assessments, which gives us information about procedural justice, implicit bias, explicit bias, and all that kind of stuff. We protect officers' identities, so forth and so on. The point of this, though, is not to say just that an evidence-based solution is important. It's in terms of how we reframe this for a new generation coming along that has been, to a degree, shaken loose. If we imagine that there is racial prejudice in law enforcement, and everybody in this room doesn't have to imagine it, then why would we imagine that there is somehow not racial prejudice and discrimination in education, in housing, in healthcare, in employment, in every other facet of American public life? So if we see disparities in a criminal justice sphere or just in policing outcomes, how much of that is the responsibility of law enforcement? Certainly some. But how much of it is responsibility of upstream factors in housing and education and employment and healthcare? And how do we give our new leaders, our next generation, the tools to take what has been a focused conversation about the character of law enforcement and to make it a principled conversation about the character of our democracy? How do we reframe the conversation from just a matter of bad apples within blue uniforms to a conversation that is historically linked to from the signs on the water fountains to the signs they have taken off of the schools and the jobs and the hospitals? How do we give those tools so they do not despair that the signs were taken away and so that they don't have to be shaken loose? That is what I think an evidence-based approach can help to make possible. That's what this network can do, because everybody in here is using data in different ways, and that's what we can do collectively as a beloved community of folks who are using our connection to law enforcement to push the agenda. And the last part that I'll leave us with is this. In the history of civil rights struggles in this imperfect and still being created nation, when was the last time that you had the oppressor group and the oppressed sharing values and working together to move it forward? Never before have we had such a moment of good news race story at the exact same time that we have shocking, no pun intended, arrestingly bad news on the same topic. And so as we move into our lunchtime conversation, I invite you to celebrate the fact that this is not just a unique opportunity because of the historical moment, but that it's also a unique win in the space of racial justice because law enforcement is with this movement, not against it. And with that, I think we are right at about time to grab sandwich. We got about 5 minutes? No, you want to go ahead and have a conversation? What? Oh, we're going to 1. Okay. Somebody did not get the memo. So with that, what I think I will have to do is then invite, can we get folks to stand when they have their questions, okay? And I believe that Pastor Copeland is going to go ahead and do that. And I do apologize. Part of the consequence of me not getting the memo is I am scheduled to take a flight. And so I'm going to have to, in way too early, abandon this panel right now, basically. I'm going to ask Pastor Copeland to go ahead and call on the audience. And if folks, we have a microphone right there, if folks can raise their hands, I'd appreciate it.
Questions? David, you gonna? So you could moderate.
Thank you for this excellent panel. I think one thing, watching this debate unfold over the past year, has been this, one of the troubling things has been this sort of either-or narrative, that you sort of, either you care about police reform or you care about violence in the community. And if you raise one, the other side instantly thinks that you're trying to change the subject and deflect. And part of that is that some people actually have been doing it, and it's been extremely unhelpful. How do we broaden, well, first, do you think that sort of powerful hashtag Black Lives Matter should incorporate all of the issues that the national network is focused on? And if so, how do we start changing that narrative?
Well, I'll answer the last question first and then double back around. We're in relationship with the Black Lives Matter folks, and, we had some other clergy folks that were saying, well, Black Lives Matter needs to mean such and such. And our answer was, it should mean whatever it is they meant it to mean when they put it together. I do think we suffer, throughout the country in this narrative around the either-or context, and I think for that, it's incredibly important to have people that have the relationship that the pastor was talking about through the whole continuum. So from law enforcement to folks that are very conservative in their approach and thought process, all the way along continuum of folks who might be very liberal and have a very different kind of conversation, and find ways that we might not always agree equally around what's happening, but how do we continue to have ways to talk to one another and find ways to pass information that's helpful up and down the pipeline. A quick example is we had an event in Oakland where we had Dream Defenders there from Florida, folks that organized around Trayvon Martin. We had Hands Up United, folks that we met when we were in Ferguson. We had Oscar Grant's mother, which is a part of our Oakland story, all on a panel. But I also involved Captain Armstrong from the Oakland Police Department, who I'm in relationship with, who we do the procedural justice work together. He sat on the panel where one of the leaders said on the microphone, I believe we don't need to have any police departments at all. We need to disband them all. And 500 people clapped. And then I gave the mic to LeRon because he was next. He got the microphone, and rather than getting frustrated, and rather than, he told his story about calling the police and why he feels called to police and why he cares, and when he sees these images, why it breaks his heart, and why it continues to remind him how, Oakland Police Department wants to figure out how to continue to do a better job, so on and so forth. When people left that meeting, they were talking more about LeRon's conversation and testimony than the images of people being killed on the screen. I think we can do it, but I don't think we're going to be able to talk it through. We've got to actually demonstrate it, find ways to have shared sessions, share conversations, and build real relationship with one another.
So if I may, David was going to come down to Orlando, I forgot when that was, not long ago, because I'm part of a group called the Gospel Coalition, which is fairly a conservative collection of Christian networks. And so we had Rob Lang and I think the police chief from Sanford, Florida, Cecil Smith, and a few others, for the very purpose of trying to do what my brother just said, is model in a panel how you can have the actual discussion without getting caught in these binary sort of eddies. You know, so when you start talking about crime, then somebody's going to bring up black-on-black crime. When you start talking about this, somebody's going to talk about that, and all these types of things. So I was able to rely on some training that I received, if I'm not mistaken, at one of these national network situations as it relates to starting out any conversation with shared values. There are certain things that nobody disagrees about. We've had to even employ this as recently as in, I think it was January or earlier this year, where the chief of police, the mayor, and myself held a joint press conference because of some violence that erupted in our community that was very divisive and was bringing up some heated emotions, but we were able to stand there and starting with the shared value that everyone wants to be safe. Everyone wants their children safe. We were able to just logically sort of walk through some things that everybody could agree on. Now, how that happens nationally, I don't know, but I do know and I do agree with what has just been said, that we can't discount the value of relationships, the relationships that we might have personally with people across the political spectrum, the relationships we might have with people who have platforms that we would never be invited to speak on, and the relationships we have with influencers who don't ever make the headlines, but they are helping to shape the ethos of a particular community or a particular aspect of our national debate.
I'm of the mindset that people have to feel that they can touch the police department because we are their police department. It's not Chief A.C. Roper's police department. The police department belongs to the citizens of the city of Birmingham. And so we have to be purposeful in how we give them those opportunities and open our doors to them because we are for the most part, we have been a closed society. We've went into communities and we've tried to tell them what was best for them. And when you look back now, we know that that was not the right thing to do. And so we're looking for ways on a local level to open those doors. And our faith community is some of our biggest partners. Every month I have the honor of walking through neighborhoods with members of our faith community on what we call monthly prayer walks. So Saturday morning, we were in one of our toughest public housing communities. And it's amazing how people run out the doors. They bring their kids out because they want to take a picture with the chief. And so it's just great. And this one little thing happened Saturday where this mother, her little son was on the porch. He's 6 years old. And Mama said, "There's Chief A.C. Roper." And so I go over to talk, and I have to go over there and talk because I love talking to kids and people. And so Mama says he wants to be a police officer. And I asked him, I said, "How are you doing in school?" He said, "I make great grades." And so I said, "Mama, can I give him a gift?" And she said, "Go ahead." So I had to give him a gift out of my pocket for that. And then I got his phone number, and I told her I'll be checking on him. I'll be mentoring him. It's going to be a great relationship because I don't have a son at home, but I just found one Saturday morning. He's 6 years old. He's 6 years old. And so we need more of that, but it can't just be from the chief. We need that up and down the entire organization and across the width of the organization. And how do we codify that and make that a part of how we're doing business? We just looked at our school stats, and our arrest numbers are down almost 50% for the last school year. We're excited about that. But as I shared with the staff, I want them down even more the next school year because kids can't learn when the officers are arresting them and taking them out of school. And so it's been a partnership with our school system because we need them to be the first line of response, not the school resource officer. We need the teachers and the school administration to be the ones that's going to first address that need. And so how do we take that from a local level to a national discussion? having a relationship with our strongest detractors, the ones who talk against us the most, I think is important. And it's challenging to go into that room and sit down with people who you know are going to criticize you. But it takes backbone, and that's what leaders do. And so, as I shared with the leader of our Black Lives Matter organization, there's so much that we agree on. We agree on a lot of stuff. We both agree that Black Lives Matter. My 19-year-old brother was murdered in Birmingham. My wife's 27-year-old brother was murdered in Birmingham. So we have walked the walk. We know Black lives should matter. But how can we now, you work with me and I worked with you, so that these mothers don't have to get so many phone calls about their sons being killed in the streets of Birmingham. And so we've got to find those areas where we agree on, and let's build trust there. Because there are some things we may not ever agree on, but there's so much that we agree on that if we can build progress right there, then we can build a relationship that can help us in some of those other areas.
Hi, I'm Charles Hardwick. I'm from Chicago, and I run a reentry program that's supported by the Illinois Department of Corrections. So I really just wanted to make a few statements. One of the statements is that we talk about liquor stores and churches on every block. The difference is the liquor store is open 7 days a week. The church is only open on Sunday.
Yes, sir.
We talk about how do we turn our hoods back into neighborhoods, and I just want to say, intelligent, Black, smart people, come back home.
Okay. The focus of this, according to this, is about how things have been changing. Chief Roper, you made a statement going back 52 years ago, and what Dr. Martin Luther King stated. And over those 52 years, we're talking about, I just want to ask, particularly in your opinion, Chief, has there been any changes that's been going on in America, or from your perspective, even in Birmingham? Have there been changes that's been going on until just the past couple of years? The last couple of years, we've seen incredible chaos, tragedies, events of notoriety that have brought issues to the forefront. And I hate that those issues have happened to bring, or those events have happened. But the issues have come forth a lot more rapid because of them. But what has been going on to this point? In your observation, have there been changes that were in motion that were good? And if not, what have we been doing wrong until we have now had these issues to, I guess, be thrown right in our face?
What a powerful question. I will start by saying there's two types of change. There's evolutionary change, which takes time, it's very slow, and there's revolutionary change, which is quick and sudden. And I think we've been in the midst of some evolutionary change, but the tensions and the friction and these brutal incidents that we've seen over the last couple of years has quickened the pace of change. In Birmingham, we asked for body cameras before the Ferguson incident. And of course, we got the funding for phase one because no city government official was going to stand up and say, we can't find the money. And so they found the funding. So we have over 300 cameras out there now. It's the largest rollout of body cameras in the state of Alabama, and we still have more work to do there. But friction has increased the pace, and I think social media has increased the pace of the change because now we really do have the power of one. So any person with a phone can now take the video, upload it within a minute, and it's out there for the world to see. So I think those types of things have really forced a lot of law enforcement agencies to be more responsive. It's unfortunate to say that the only person who likes change is a wet baby. Very few other people like change. And one thing about police officers, and I've been one for 30 plus years now, We don't like the way things are, and we don't like change. And some of this change is being forced by external factors, and that's okay. But the goal is to get down the road and get to a spot where we're providing the quality of services that our communities need, especially our most challenged communities. So no matter how we get there, whether it's willingly or unwillingly, because if we don't protect our profession and do a better job of changing, someone will change it for us. And so I think it's good that we have so many chiefs now that are standing up and saying there's a better way of providing police services.
Hello, I'm Jay Gilmer from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the question is, have any of you found some good ways to discuss discretion in policing with community forums in ways that can be constructive? There's a constructive discussion on discretion in policing.
Well, I just to say again, we'll lift up, I think the procedural justice training really revisits a lot of the cores of policing that really help to address, I think, the issue of discretion in the sense of causing police officers and departments to begin to think about how do we really determine probable cause? And then how do we also realize that there is an existing story that's going on in the lives of the people that we police. And so when we show up at their door, recognizing that just myself, the officer in a uniform, is not the only person showing up at the door, but the history of policing in America could potentially be showing up at the door of that person as well. And how can officers have discretion in recognition of that history and of that reality to ensure that they actually provide for the people in the community a kind of a measured policing that keeps in mind that this person might be dealing with a high degree of post-traumatic stress disorder because of the kind of experience that they've had, and how can I ensure that I'm leaning back a little bit and using some discretion, keeping in mind the potential story of the person that I'm policing, and then being able to have some interaction based on that. We had a few officers out of the procedural justice training that we were doing in Oakland say that after going through the training, when they began to re-engage with the community, doing their jobs, it gave them an opportunity to think a little bit differently. Even at the protest, I was at the protest line in my collar, and several of the officers stepped forward and said, being here and having had that training gave me different things to think about while I was standing here on the protest line. And so I started playing the things that you were saying in the training while I was here, and it just gave me a different way to interact.
So did I understand your question correctly? You were asking how it can be explained to the public? Okay, so in addition to what he just said, both the public as well as the law enforcement community need to recognize not only, what did you say, post-traumatic stress, but this whole concept of vicarious trauma, how it didn't have to happen to me. I was at the barbershop, I heard what happened to my cousin. I go to church, and I heard what happened to Sister Susie's son, and that deeply affects me. So in my opinion, every community needs to have some translators. That is to say, people in the community who are not part of law enforcement, but who understand enough about procedural justice, enough about how things actually work, that it doesn't really work like CSI or what you see on TV. The crime isn't going to be solved in 48 minutes. When you have enough people of influence like that who can help to translate in the community, I think that's what makes the difference. And every community does have those translators. You have to find them. And I'd like to tie that back into what was said earlier. While it is true that every community has on every corner, or distressed communities might have on every corner a church and a liquor store or whatever, but the churches aren't open 24 hours a day. That is true, but there are influencers in every community. In some churches, not every church has influence, but there are influencers and there are translators who are waiting for somebody to invite them so that they can help you to do what you're trying to do because it's in their best interest and you share the same values as it relates to safety in the community.
Let me take a shot at tying some of this together. And also, Phil's last remark turns out being the panel between you and lunch is not nearly as significant as being the panel between you and the airport. So I respect that. But Phil's last comment was, when have we been in a situation in which the protesters and those against whom they are protesting agree on so much? And we are finding something like that all over the country. Right? You could not have gone to Lester Maddox and say, you should stop doing what you're doing, it's hurting the black community, because he would have said, yeah, that's the point, right? That's what I'm in it for. Whereas, you know, you've heard a bunch of people today say, we know we're doing this wrong, we're looking for ways to do different. That's a very different situation. And it's because I know you and what you're doing, it's without putting words in your mouth, you know, that is a place in which you find yourself. You are committed to change. And in many of our communities, we have Pastor McBride and the Reverend Copeland who are deeply committed to change, but are not in the camp that wishes the police to go away forever. They see a need for the police, they want a different kind of policing, they're willing to work with. Their analysis and experience does not presume hatred and racism. It can presume, for example, bad use of discretion. Right? In my city, when there were 800,000 street stops a year, it wasn't because individual NYPD officers were racist. It was because their hierarchy had told them to do that. And when their hierarchy told them something else, they did something else. But it leaves us in a place in many cities that I'm going to describe as follows, and then you can see whether this makes sense and how you are all working it. But there's leadership in the police department that is committed to change and is in fact way out ahead of its own rank and file. And there's a lot of leadership in the community that is committed to change, but has at least a different understanding of the situation than many other people in the community, and see systems and error and discretion rather than racism and malevolence. And those leaders find themselves in a position of really not so much disagreeing with each other as much as they disagree with their own. And what you're all trying to do is to move your own community to where you are in a constructive, workable way. So that may or may not be right, but is there anything there? And if there is, how are you managing those dynamics?
I just want to push back real quickly, just a little bit, because I know we're all leaning into we're all starting to have this wonderful kumbaya moment, and it's wonderful. I love it, but I still think that we have to lift up that we still do have the existence of, at minimum, racial anxiety in some of our departments, and that there are still people that lean into racist ideologies that find themselves into some of these departments. Now, I think all of us that work on this know that it's not the case for the majority of police officers, and I think, so I think we got to work towards that, but I just think we got to be careful where the whole conversation doesn't become about discretion, and that's the only reason things are happening, but that we still do have, an ideology that doesn't just exist in policing, but, is happening throughout the stretch of broader society, and it's still something I think we need to work against.
So if I understood your statement correctly, law enforcement leadership in several different venues is ahead of rank and file on these matters, and actually some community leaders are ahead of their constituency as it relates to viewing this comprehensively.
Does that feel right to you?
It does, in one sense, and the issue is, how do you broaden that circle? How can you push the center out a little bit further so it's inappropriate? The things that he just described can no longer find a hiding place. Right. They're not allowed, and on the other fringe, bashing law enforcement just to be bashing law enforcement because you're mad about something else can't be allowed as well. So I think that part of expanding that circle is this idea of some type of continuous exposure that is not based on crisis. Because if the only time that we're engaging one another is at crisis, then, adrenaline, the default biases and all manner of other things come into play, whereas if we can see one another in different aspects. So on a simple, small level, just for example, in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a police youth safety camp at the church. Police officers in our local community came up with this themselves. I don't even think it came down from the top. They basically said, hey, we'll have a camp, we'll do some athletics, we'll do some this, we'll do some that. Basically, it's a day camp for the kids, but what it has done is it's given the kids an opportunity to see cops when they're not coming to arrest somebody. And it gives the cops an opportunity to see kids who aren't doing anything other than being kids. And so if there's a way that we can scale up those types of exposures, I don't know how you do that, but I'm just saying there has to be some type of structural way that the circle can be expanded, because we're actually engaging one another when there's no business to transact, and we can just be human as opposed to whatever it is we title ourselves.
Let me say I totally concur with the fact that we have to engage before the crisis, because the equivalent would be trying to build a roof in the storm. You got to build it before the storm and establish those relationships prior. But I think in law enforcement, when we really look at the spectrum, we have to evolve and embrace. When I mentioned the evolutionary change, there are some things we have to evolve in with our training, with the way we operate, and there are some things we have to embrace. The new technologies, the way we operate in a crisis. So I don't know if it's in my bio, but I've been in the military for 30 plus years, and this over-militarization of police work, things that have just evolved over the years. And I think some departments would like to change, but they're not sure how to change. And that's where the national network is a great help for us in showing us ways that we can be more effective and more efficient in the way we address our communities, the way we try to reduce crime and restore public order and all that stuff. And so I think we're on the right track. So many of us are on the right track, but it's going to take some time, some heavy lifting. It's going to take some work. It's going to take some criticism, but we've just got to commit ourselves to stay in the fight.
Thanks.
Can I add one other thing that I think we underestimate a lot, and it was brought up earlier, and if this issue is expanding this circle of understanding so that we have more room to debate and dialogue about those things that are really out of sync, or celebrate those things that are really doing well. We have to do a better job locally as well as regionally, however you want to look at it, in managing the media, because that's what's helping to frame, that's what's coloring a lot of the conversations, and why we can't talk like we need to talk, because if you watch MSNBC and I watch Fox,
we're in trouble.
We're in trouble. You see what I'm saying? We'll never really be able to have a productive conversation. But if we can find ways to really, I think we have to be more proactive. When I say we, I'm talking about the network, people who are here, have to be more proactive in finding ways to calling out the media when they go over the line as it relates to dealing with untruths or coloring the way the narrative is to their satisfaction as opposed to what's going to bring progress. And we have to challenge one another as it relates to our intake of media. Where are you getting your information from, and is that information accurate?
I'm going to take one more, if there is one more. Phil appears to be right about this whole lunch thing. Can we thank the panelists?